I delivered this presentation at a Sunday school for the adults at Midway Presbyterian Church on September 28, 2014. Several of the members of the Sunday school asked if I had put this together in any one place, so I'm doing this basically for those members of that Sunday school who want to pursue this, and I'm going to invite you along for the ride. This is a longer presentation than I made at the Sunday school because in this presentation I'm going to be reading the actual texts. I didn't read all of them in Sunday school, so this makes it longer. But it makes it a lot more effective because the texts are really what are important. My comments can help you, but the texts really are crucial, and I want you to remember the texts because they are what will carry the theology of this presentation. I'll make you a deal. Give me 5 minutes. If after 5 minutes you're still bored, then just don't watch the video. But as long as I keep this interesting, I would ask that you keep going because at the end we're going to come to some unique conclusions which maybe you have not heard before. I begin with covenant theology. I want to talk about the 5 points of the biblical covenant. And the first point is transcendence, the transcendence of God, but also the presence of God. This is not a God so distant that he doesn't understand us or communicate to us. So transcendence is another word for sovereignty, but let's call it transcendence. Then there is hierarchy. In every covenant, human or not, in other words, supernatural or not, there has got to be a hierarchical system of some kind. And your basic covenants are the personal covenant, the family covenant, the church covenant, and the civil covenant. And in all of them, there is hierarchy. Let's call it authority. Then there is ethics. Every covenant, every covenantal system has an ethical foundation. Let's call this law. Every covenant has a legal system. Then there's the oath. This is what establishes a covenant. We're most familiar with this with marriage. There is a marriage oath or a marriage covenant, and the two parties exchange oaths together. Let's call this sanctions because it has to do with sanctions, both positive and negative. And finally, there is succession. Every covenant has a system of succession. Let's use the family issue. That is inheritance because that is what is at stake in the book of Ruth. It is about succession. It is about inheritance. There is a nice mnemonic device or memory device associated with this structure, theos. That is the Greek word for God. So it's easy to remember this structure if you use theos as your device, mnemonic device, to trigger your memory. Now let's go to a text that is not usually associated with an understanding of the book of Ruth. But for those of us who are Christians, it is, I believe, the crucial text. This is Mathew 1. This is how the New Testament begins. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. Of course, that's Judah. And Judas begat Phares and Zerah of Tamar. And Phares begat Esrom, and Esrom begat Aram, and Aram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Nason, and Nason begat Salmon, and Salmon begat Booz, of course that's Boaz, of Rahab, and Boaz begat Obed of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David the king, and David the king begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Urias, or Uriah. So here we have the covenantal line of succession. This is how Matthew begins. In this covenantal line, 4 women are mentioned. And this is unique. You would normally think of this as being exclusively masculine, but this is not the case. You have a reference to Phares, and of course the brother Zerah of Tamar. You have the reference to Boaz of Rahab. Then you have Obed, who is of Ruth, and Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. 4 women mentioned. And I want to begin with this in order that you can understand what the real theological issues are in the book of Ruth. They are covenantal issues. They are issues of inheritance. Boaz is named, yet in terms of the Mosaic law, he was not in the line of succession. By Mosaic law, Obed is in the line of Elimelech, but Elimelech, Naomi's husband, is dropped from the genealogy. So are his sons. And this is the key to understanding the book of Ruth. It goes back to the law that is sometimes called the Levirate law, the brother's law. It goes back to Deuteronomy 25. Here's what the legality was. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. We, of course, don't have this law today. It was a law associated with the land and the seed, and these have been annulled by the new covenant. But they were crucially important laws, seed laws and land laws, and this was extremely important. Why? The name. A man's name, because he was part of a tribe, and the tribes had to be kept separate, and they had detailed genealogies. A man's name, as being part of the covenant of Israel, was crucial to the definition of that man. It was a covenantal definition. And it was so important that if a man died and he did not have an heir, then the brother who was nearby, it says specifically, brethren dwelling together, the brother who was not married, but who was nearby, had to go in and marry the woman who had previously been his sister-in-law. And the firstborn of that union would not be, judicially speaking, his child. It would be the child of the dead brother. This was how the name was preserved in Israel. So why was Elimelech dropped? It has to do with the central theme of the book of Ruth, and that theme is adoption. The central theme of that book is adoption. So let's look at Ezekiel 16. Adoption in the Old Covenant is through marriage. God adopted Israel. And here are the texts. And say, Thus saith the Lord God unto Jerusalem, Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan. Thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother an Hittite. And as for thy nativity, in the day thou wast born, thy navel was not cut, neither wast thou washed in water to supple thee. Thou wast not salted at all, nor swaddled at all. This is a cast-off child. This is how Ezekiel describes the nation of Israel. None I pitied thee to do any of these unto thee, to have compassion upon thee, but thou wast cast out in the open field to the loathing of thy person in the day that thou wast born. And when I passed by thee and saw thee polluted in thine own blood, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. Yea, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. Now this is adoption. This is how God described his relationship to Israel. These words were put into the mouth of Ezekiel. Israel was the daughter of a Canaanite. He's speaking, of course, covenantally. But in terms of any confidence Israel should have in her own righteousness, there wasn't any. I have caused thee to multiply as the bud of the field, and thou hast increased and waxen great, and thou art come to excellent ornaments. Thy breasts are fashioned, and thine hair is grown, whereas thou wast naked and bare. This is the description of a young woman ready for marriage. And the marriage takes place through adoption. God adopts Israel and makes Israel his wife. Now, when I passed by thee and looked upon thee, behold, thy time was the time of love, and I spread my skirt over thee, and I covered thy nakedness. Yea, I swear unto thee, and entered into a covenant with thee, saith the Lord God, and thou becamest mine. So adoption is by marriage. God adopts Israel in this case, and Israel became the bride of God. Lawful bride of God, based on the grace of God in healing Israel and making Israel his wife. This is the essence of adoption in the Old Testament. And it's also the essence of adoption in the New Testament. Now we have the story of Tamar. And it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned into a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her. All right, here's your classic example. You're going to go out to the Canaanite, and you're going to bring the Canaanite into your household, and your name and your inheritance goes on this woman. This is a form of adoption. This was adoption by marriage. And she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name And she conceived again and bare a son, and she called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah, and he was at Chezib when she bare him. So, 3 sons. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. Sanctions, negative sanctions for covenant breaking, violated the law of God, and the covenantal sanction of death was brought against him. There was no child. And Judah said unto Onan, Go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother. And Onan knew that the seed should not be his. And it came to pass, when he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled it on the ground, lest that he should give seed to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, wherefore he slew him also. Now what was this? This was a ritual act of defiance. Now the Mosaic law had not been given, but it was clear here that there was an understanding in that household of the principle of the seed of the brother. And Onan would not consent to this law. And ritually, he defied God and the woman who was supposed to be his wife. And God killed him right there. No muss, no fuss. He was dead. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, Remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah my son be grown. For he said, Lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. And in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted, and went up unto his sheep shearers to Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. So off they go to another town, where, of course, there's anonymity. And it was told to Tamar, saying, Behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to Timnath to shear his sheep. And she put her widow's garments off from her, and covered her with a veil, and wrapped herself and sat in an open place, which is by the way to Timnath. For she saw that Selah was grown, and she was not given unto him to wife. Now this is years after the death of Onan. She is still wearing a widow's garb. And that means she's announcing to all other men she's not eligible. And the issue is succession. The issue is inheritance. The issue is the name, her name, and the name of her children, especially a son, in Israel. She wants the inheritance, and it's the inheritance from Abraham to Jacob and to the sons. And she wants to be part of that covenant line, and so she waits. And she waits, and she waits, and she waits. No son. So now she sees a way of gaining her goal. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be an harlot, because she had covered her face. And he turned unto her by the way, and said, Go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee. For he knew not she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What wilt thou give me, that thou mayest come in unto me? Which means, of course, what are you going to pay me? She's playing the role of the harlot. She isn't a harlot. She's a wife who has been spurned, but she's going to play the harlot because harlots want money. So she goes along with the act. And he said, I will send thee a kid from the flock. And she said, Wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it? And he said, What pledge shall I give thee? And she said, Thy signet and thy bracelets and thy staff that is in thine hand. And he gave it to her and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. So this is a down payment. This is a pledge that she's going to get paid. This is a pledge of future payment, signet, bracelets, and staff. And she arose and went away and laid by her veil from her and put on the garments of her widowhood. Now that is a covenantal act. And if she's pregnant, which she was, that was a powerful covenantal act. And it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot. Boy, wasn't that true. There's one of the most powerful lines you could have. Played the harlot. That's in both senses. Played the harlot. She had indeed. And also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, Bring her forth and let her be burnt. Now why? Why was this a capital crime? Prostitution is not a capital crime in the Mosaic law, and even earlier, except with one exception, one big exception, the daughter of a priest. The daughter of a priest was burnt according to the Mosaic law. Okay, so what does Judah say? We got to burn this woman. Why? Not because she played the harlot, but she played the harlot while being in her widowhood, being set aside covenantally for Judah's son. She was betrothed, and then she played the harlot. And with this, he condemns himself. When she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, By the man whose these are, I am with child. And she said, Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet and bracelets and staff? Oh boy, is he caught not just flat-footed, he is caught symbolically with his pants down. And he's the father of this child. And what does he say? And Judah acknowledged them and said, She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more. He knows exactly what the issue is. This is a covenantal issue. This is not that she's played the harlot. This is that he did not give to her the son she deserved to maintain herself in the covenant line and to establish her children as part of the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He has broken covenant with this woman. Now, he didn't commit adultery. Remember, his wife was dead. He did not commit a capital crime. But what he did was to commit this sin, and the sin was not just the sexual escapade. The primary sin was he broke his covenant promise to her. He broke his oath, his covenant oath to this woman. And it came to pass, when she travailed, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took it and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, This came out first. And it came to pass, as he drew back his hand, that, behold, his brother came out, and she said, How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez. Remember, Pharez is listed in the covenant line in Matthew. And you have no further references in the scriptures to the brother. The brother who almost was first, almost was the firstborn, but did not become the firstborn. His brother became the firstborn, and he enters the covenant line. And so the crimson thread did not count, because he pulled back his hand and out came the brother. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah. And you don't hear anything about him again. Briefly in Matthew, he is acknowledged as one of the sons, but he plays no further role in the covenant line of Israel. Now, Genesis 49. Why is this all so important? This is the end of Jacob's life. He's dying. And he's now passing on the inheritance to his sons. And here's what he says of Judah. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Who's Shiloh? Christian theology has always maintained that Shiloh is the prophesied Messiah. Shiloh is Jesus Christ. That is the fulfillment of this prophecy. And this is why the tribes of Israel had to be kept apart down through the ages. Because the promise of the Messiah, Shiloh, would come through the family line of Judah. Now, Deuteronomy 23. A bastard shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. The forever was not literal, it was 10th generation, but the language was powerful. So two groups, actually three, were kept out. The bastard, the Ammonite, and the Moabite. These were the bad guys. Egypt could come in 3 generations, but not a bastard, not an Ammonite, and not a Moabite. Now this begins to point toward the book of Ruth, for she was a Moabite. But this was the law of the land. Now let's go back to Matthew 1. Let's look at this genealogy. Pharez, Ezram, Aram, Aminadab, Nason, Salmon, Boaz. Of course, it's Boaz in the text, but it's Boaz. We know who that is. Obed, Jesse, David. Aha! 10 generations. Now, we know there were more than 10 generations, and they knew back then. These people were not fooled. These are the 10 generations that are listed. There was an exodus at around, from a biblical standpoint, something around 1491 or 1492 BC. So the time of the conquest of the land of Canaan, was sometime around the mid-15th century, around 1450, that period. And Jericho fell. And that is when the covenant line extended to Rahab. We know that David was born sometime around maybe 1100 BC. So there are hundreds of years in between Rahab and the man who finally is brought in, Boaz? Well, we're not told who they were. The reason Matthew gives this is to make a point. David is the 10th generation. He's the king. He is no longer under the restriction with respect to membership in the congregation that had applied because of Tamar. Because judicially speaking, the sons of Tamar were not part of a lawful marriage. But in terms of the covenant promise, they were. And in terms of Mosaic law, Pharez was a bastard. But in this text, it's clear that Matthew is placing David as the 10th generation, and now he's the king. He's the father of Solomon. Again, David was listed as number 10 to demonstrate that he was free of the curse that was on the covenant line of Judah because of Pharez. And this was understood by Jacob. He knew what had happened with the covenant line of Judah. But what he was prophesying was at some point in the future that there would be a kingly line that would exercise the sword, and it would extend down through Shiloh, whoever Shiloh would be. In Matthew 1, Bathsheba is not named. Isn't that peculiar? Let's not forget the situation in which Bathsheba was brought into David's line. She had committed adultery. David could have been executed, and she could have been executed according to the Mosaic law. Now, nobody brought charges, but that was a capital offense. David and Bathsheba had committed adultery. Her husband is named in this genealogy. Uriah is named, she is not. He was the victim twice. David committed adultery with his wife, and then David had him killed, a double victim. And his family had been adopted. He was Uriah the Hittite. He was someone from outside of Israel who at some point had been brought in through marriage, through adoption, and he became part of Israel. And he is named here in this description of the covenant line of Jesus. His name appears and Bathsheba's does not appear. He, like Rahab and Ruth, represents deliverance for the Gentiles, adoption into the covenant. And it's right here at the very beginning of the New Testament, in the opening lines of the Gospel of Matthew. Uriah is named and Bathsheba is not. Uriah is the representative, as far as a judicial matter is concerned, a representative of the Gentiles, the possibility of adoption into the covenant. And the son of the adulterous union dies, the baby dies. And the second-born son, the true heir of David, was Solomon. And he became king, and then it is through Solomon that Jesus is born. It is the second-born son who is the true heir. And that is exactly right, because Adam, the first Adam, was the son who rebelled and who brought humanity under the curses of the law and the curses of God. And Jesus, as in this sense, the second Adam, is the deliverer, the Messiah. Now, Rahab and the spies, and you have to pay attention to this one. Why is she in the genealogy? But she had brought them up to the roof of the house and hid them with the stalks of flax which she had laid in order upon the roof. And Rahab switches sides at this point. She establishes a new covenant. She protects the spies. And she demands a covenantal oath from them, and they give her that oath. Now therefore, I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that ye will also show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token, and that ye will save alive my father, and my mother, and my brethren, and my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. New covenant. This is treason against Jericho. This is a rebellion against the gods of Jericho, and it establishes a covenant with the God of Israel. And the men answered her, our life for yours, if ye utter not this our business. And it shall be, when the Lord hath given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with thee. Then she let them down by a cord through the window, for her house was upon the town wall, and she dwelt upon the wall. Behold, when we come into the land, thou shalt bind this line of scarlet thread in the window, which thou didst let us down by, and thou shalt bring thy father and thy mother and thy brethren and all thy father's household home unto thee. Scarlet thread. We're back to Tamar. Scarlet thread as the mark of the covenant line. Now, in the attack, by the way, how would all the attackers see this little bitty scarlet thread? Well, actually, it wasn't that difficult to see. Because where did she live? She lived in the wall. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the wall came tumbling down. Mostly. But part of the wall didn't come tumbling down. And in that part of the wall, there was covenantal protection. In that part of the wall, they could see the crimson thread, and she was protected. She got the protection of God in terms of a covenantal oath. She was adopted into Israel, adopted with her whole family. Now we go to the family of Elimelech. Now this was down through Salmon and Rahab. And the family fled to Moab in a famine. In other words, they abandoned the promised land to go into an unfavored land to get food. And both sons married Moabite women. Typical, happens down through the generations. They go off to the non-covenantal wives in a non-covenantal nation, and they get a wife out of that nation. And both of the men did it. Now, what did it mean? It meant that they didn't think they were going back to Israel. They thought they were going to become citizens, or at least residents, of a foreign nation with a foreign covenant, and they established a covenantal bond with that nation, in that nation, by means of marriage. In effect, those wives were adopting them into the covenant line of Moab. That's the judicial meaning of this. Only that was not how it worked out. Both died without children, and we don't know which husband married which woman. There's no way to establish that by the text. The names are essentially forgotten. They're scrambled because we don't know who was who. And Naomi saw her covenant line as having ended. And at this point, she gave up hope. She gave up hope in the inheritance. She was an old woman. She was now finished in terms of the covenant line. And she tells her daughters-in-law to stay in the land. She's going back to Israel, but she tells them to stay. Why? Because it's their covenant. They're bound by covenants. And their husbands, who in effect had defected and who had joined the covenant of Moab, they were both dead. There were no sons. It was finished for Naomi. Turn again, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have an husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have an husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them for having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. Well, this is covenantal despair, if you've ever heard it. And she's saying, yes, you could wait for me till my sons are grown. You are legally part of the covenant line. Yes, but you're going to have to wait for 20 years, and that assumes I can find a husband, and that assumes I've got sons. Forget about it. I'm leaving. You stay. And then we have the confession. And they lifted up their voice and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. So they love her. It's a confession of love. They love her, their mother-in-law. They think she's terrific. But Orpah leaves. She sees the logic of this. She can't wait around forever. So she goes back to find a husband in the land. She maintains the covenant, but not Ruth. And Ruth then swears an oath. And I believe, certainly from a point of view of artistic power, of memorability, this is the most famous covenant oath in the Bible. The most moving oath in the Bible, that's for sure. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so unto me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. This is the oath. This is an oath of ethical and covenantal union with the God of the Bible by means of going back to the land and being a faithful daughter-in-law, even though she may never get a husband. This is commitment. And she returns back to Israel with Naomi. And then we have the story of Ruth as she gathers the grain in the field, which was part of the gleaning law, and Boaz notices her, and so forth. I don't want to go into the economics of it. I've written several chapters of a commentary, my economic commentary on the Bible, on this aspect of it. I don't want to go into it here. But finally, Naomi says, look, this is a kinsman of yours. So you go in to him and you make yourself available. And so Ruth approaches him at night and lays down beside him. And he said, when he woke up, by the way, he had gone to sleep, but he woke up in the middle of the night and he said, Who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. And boy, was he happy. And he said, Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter. For thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether rich or poor. So here is a middle-aged man who didn't get married, and all of a sudden, this attractive woman who is a hard worker, who has already caught his attention, a righteous woman who is supporting her mother-in-law, all of a sudden, she comes in the door in the middle of the night and says, Put your skirt over me. I'm your kinsman. She proposed to him. And was he happy? And now, my daughter, fear not. I will do to thee all that thou requirest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. She has come back from this essentially pagan nation, from Moab, and serves her mother-in-law faithfully, and word gets out. Well, you can imagine word would get out on this one. I mean, this is a Moabitess and is as faithful as anybody in that community. And he knows it, and he wants her for his wife. The nearest of kin, the kinsman-redeemer, refuses to buy Naomi's field, and thereby also take her daughter-in-law as wife. Boaz was not the nearest of kin. The nearest of kin was another man. So Boaz and Naomi went to him and said, Buy the field, because Naomi needed money, buy the field, which would mean temporarily. But to do that, to gain control of that field goes to your firstborn son by way of Ruth, not by way of anybody else. The firstborn son of Ruth inherits that land, and he turns down the deal. So Now, Boaz is eligible to marry her because the next of kin, who is called the kinsman-redeemer, it is an actual office in Israel, the nearest of kin, the Gaal, the kinsman-redeemer says, I don't want her. I don't want the field on those terms, and Boaz wants the field on those terms. And now he is legally allowed to marry her. And Boaz accepts the office of kinsman-redeemer. See, it's transferred now to him. It had been in the possession of the other man, the nearest of kin, and he gives it up. And so now this office of kinsman-redeemer is transferred to Boaz. Do you understand the judicial implication of this? Who is the kinsman-redeemer of history? It's Jesus Christ. And Boaz accepts the office of kinsman-redeemer for this family and then enters the covenant line of the ultimate kinsman-redeemer in history, the one who redeems his people. And he enters the covenant line. He is mentioned in the covenant line in Matthew because we don't know which of the brothers was the husband of Ruth in Moab. He adopted her and then became the father of her child, Obed. See, it was an adoption process. That's what the book is about. It's about adoption. And Matthew's genealogy drops the name of Elimelech and whichever of the sons that she had married. Of course, we don't know. The only name we know is Boaz. He is now mentioned in the covenant genealogy. Conclusions. The central issue of the book of Ruth is succession. Covenantal succession in history. And access to the covenant line was by adoption. She was a Moabite. Adoption was by marriage. She married one Israelite who had left the land, and he died, and her only hope of reintegration into the covenant line for her sons and daughters was by way of marriage in the land of Israel, and she goes back. Tamar was part of the line, but there, of course, was no marriage. But she still was part of the line, a woman in that line, by means of a covenantal oath, the promise that was given to her and then was broken by Judah. Judah's line was under curse for 10 generations, and then comes David. David then becomes the great bearer of the sword in the line of Judah. Rahab was adopted by marriage. Now, she'd made the oath before that, but the confirmation of the oath was the adoption by marriage. That's how she entered the covenant line. She married Salmon. Ruth was adopted by marriage twice, but because the first was adoption outside the land, it wasn't clear that she would be part of the covenant line of Israel or the covenant line of Moab. That wasn't clear, but when her husband died and she went back and married again, then it was clear she was going to be in the covenant line of Israel. And Boaz entered the covenant line because the lawful kinsman-redeemer refused the office, and he took it. And Matthew named him. Now let's look a little more carefully at what that chronology was. The most famous adopted son in history is Jesus, because Joseph adopted him, and he became the father of the heir of the covenant line. He became, judicially speaking, the father of Shiloh. But it was by adoption. It was not by biology. And this brought scorn on him as a seducer. And he knew that. He knew what people would say. People counted months back then just as they count months these days. Probably a lot more carefully than they count the months these days. And so to become part of that final covenant line, he adopted Jesus into his household. Now, the second most famous adopted son in history was Augustus Caesar. And he was adopted not by marriage, but by Roman law. He was adopted by Julius Caesar. He was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. And as such, the transfer took place between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. He established the Roman Empire as the new final emperor, Caesar. He issued the decree on the taxation and the census, and this brought Joseph to Bethlehem. And Bethlehem was the city of David, and Bethlehem was the Messiah's city, and Jesus is the Messiah. All done by covenant succession, all done by oath, all done by adoption. And in the middle of the story is the greatest of all the stories of the adoption. That is, the adoption of Ruth by the new kinsman-redeemer, Boaz. And she enters the covenant line and the covenant genealogy because she was a faithful woman who broke covenant with Moab and persuaded Boaz to marry her. And by that means entered the covenant line of Shiloh.